So let's get started here. All the way through there?
Yeah, we got you. Perfect.
Okay, perfect. So what I want to talk about today is the stance and the impact that has on seeing and saving the ball. Obviously, the things that I like to preach are the importance and the value of seeing the ball and the priority that takes over everything else from how I coach it. As I mentioned previously, when I did this during the summer, my name is Tim Cassie. I live in Southern California. I coach lacrosse at Corona Del Mar High School, and I also help out with the Mad Dog lacrosse program, as well as doing private training up and down California. In the past, I had coached the goalies over at the French national team for one of the World Games in Colorado. And then, as I mentioned, I am the owner and founder of Focus Lacrosse. So I enjoy coaching goalies. It's what I like to do. And it is something that I'm very passionate about. So we'll kind of get into it now. And so what we're going to talk about today is, what is your stance? And then again, as I mentioned, how that impacts seeing the ball. So we'll start by kind of outlining what it is, the stance from a mental perspective, upper body and lower body. I think the thing about the mental side of it, obviously people wouldn't think about that being incorporated in your stance, but I think that a lot of what you think prior to a shot impacts how you are in your stance. And so we'll go over that. We'll talk about the idea of framing your stance and what that means as far as movement, their head, hands, and feet, and also patting your feet. And then obviously with all of this, how that stance impacts, your ability to see the ball. So whether you're balanced and controlled, you're patient, and you're present. So let's start with the mental part of it. So again, we'll go through these 5 points here. And like I said, I will stop the sharing to take a step back and kind of show you once we get to the other parts of it, the upper body and the lower body. But for the start, again, I think, as I mentioned before, when you're talking about the preparation, the mental part of it, obviously it's not necessarily involved with the physical part of being in your stance, but there's obviously a lot that goes into it. So for the goalies that I work with, we were talking about 5 things, 5 P's, if you will, that go into that. So the first being preparation. Other positions can just show up to practice. If it's defensemen just whacking at people and hitting people, attackmen just shooting the ball wherever they want, aimlessly being lazy instead of riding, things like that. They can do those things and just show up to practice. Goalies, it's not necessarily that easy. So we talk about pregame and pre-practice preparation, things like visualizing. I talk to the goalies about writing out things that they're stressed about to kind of deal with it beforehand, so that when they come approach it in practice or a game, they've already thought about it and prepared for it. Also, things like writing out a list of things you're worried about and crossing out those things that you can't control, so you're able to focus on a smaller list of things that are within your control to make things less stressful. The other thing, as far as the stance is concerned, when it comes to perception, is a lot of times I find that goalies on, let's say, step down shots, and this applies but also for both girls and guys across goalies, because it's all the same. It's the same position. Obviously, things are different in terms of how the shots are being taken and things, but it's all the same. So perception. So let's say from a girls lacrosse perspective, an 8-meter shot. Obviously, the odds are not really necessarily in the favor of the goalie, and it can be very challenging, especially as the women's game evolves with how they shoot. So things like if a shooter steps in on an 8-meter shot, Charlotte North, let's say, and she's going to rip the ball, the perception being that I've got no chance, this shot's coming really quickly, and so I'm going to put more value on that shot. Putting more value on that shot means prior to the shot, probably going to be more rushed, not going to be ready to find the ball and trying to move to a space really quickly rather than sitting there being patient. And the example I like to use when it comes to perception is taking a test. If I think that I'm going to fail a test and I go to take that test and I think I'm going to fail, I'm probably not going to do very well in it. The same thing with if I think the test is really easy, from a studying perspective, let's say, if I think the test is really easy, then I'm not likely to put as much effort in studying into the preparation it takes to do well on the test, and I could do well, I could not do well. Or if I think the test is really hard and I need to study a lot, then I could be more prepared. So how that applies to shooters and things like that is the example I also give is, if a shooter you think isn't very good at shooting the ball, you're not going to take the time in the process and go through the process necessary to find that ball, and you're not necessarily going to be have as much success. I know I find a lot of goalies struggle with people who aren't good shooters and they miss those shots and things like that. Same thing, if a really good shooter steps in, he's likely to be more focused and locked in on that. The next thing when it comes to the mental part of it is being present. So obviously, if you get scored on, you can't control you can't change anything that's happened in that after that goal is scored. And so it's about moving forward and resetting to the present to kind of figure out what you have to do next, whether it's find the ball next or, set yourself up for success for the next shot. And I like to always ask the goalies if they've got a time machine that allows them to go back, which obviously nobody does to date. And so, because of that, you move forward past that shot. And how that impacts your stance is, let's say you get scored off stick high and you're thinking, well, my hands dipped before the shot. And so you're thinking about that off stick high save, and then they shoot the ball stick side low. And because you're not at present finding the ball and thinking about the mechanics of how you missed that previous shot, that can impact you. The other thing, and having on their future versus the present is, if a shooter steps in to shoot the ball and you're trying to predict where they're going to shoot, that'll cause a lot of pre-shot movement. So things like falling forward. I like to say you're riding the escalator down where all that weight drives forward in your knees and you're leaning forward. And so that doesn't allow you to stay present to find the ball. And so those things can impact, your ability to be patient in your stance and stay present. The next thing is being patient in your stance, which I kind of alluded to previously, which is, guessing and waiting or versus waiting. Trying to predict where the shooter's going to shoot, trying to predict the speed that the shooter's going to take the shot at. So, if, a shooter who's 6'5", 215 steps in, you may interpret that shot as really fast. And so because of that, you may be putting more weight or value on that shot. And so that shot can feel a lot faster than it actually is. And so being patient means waiting for that ball to release out of the stick and not assessing it before the release and just reacting to it as the ball is released out of the stick. So that'll help obviously with maintaining that balance in the stance and being able to find the ball. And then the last thing is being positive. Obviously, if you're getting scored on, you're being negative to yourself, towards yourself, then that's going to have an impact on your posture, your body language, what you're giving off. And so those things all impact, your stance and how you show up, because if you get scored on and you're really frustrated, and then as you're visibly frustrated, that can show up in your stance with more tension, because now you're feeling like you're letting your team down or whatever the stressor may be that's creating that negativity, but that'll definitely impact your stance. So from that perspective, all of those things from the mental side of it definitely impact, in my opinion, how you show up and how that impacts your stance. And I'll say this about being positive towards yourself. I heard a quote one time, it was, if you spoke to your friends the way you speak to yourself, you'd have no friends. I always say that all the time. I think it's a really great quote, and I think it really rings true, particularly for playing goalie, because it is the hardest position in sports, in my opinion. And so you have to take positive things away from what you're doing. And then the other thing I'll say to that too is, I heard a study one time that was done that if you say a negative comment out loud, it has a multiplier effect of times 10. And a positive comment said out loud has a multiplier effect times 4. So for two negative comments, you have to come up with 5 positive comments to counteract that. So even if it's just a noise and you get scored on, you go, oh, that will impact you on the next one because of the negativity surrounding it. So those are the things that I mentioned as far as the mental side of it and how that impacts your stance. If we have any questions for that, I'm happy to answer it. Otherwise, I can move on to the now physical part where I'll start to show you kind of how the physical side of things impacts your ability to find the ball.
So good so far. What do you guys think in the chat? I think we're all following so far. The 5 P's of the mental game. Give me a thumbs up in the chat if you guys are following. Otherwise, Lily says, "Yeah, this is amazing." Andrew, great, all very true. Yeah, so we're so far so good.
Okay, perfect. So let's move on now to the upper body. And so these are kind of the outline. Talk about the head, hands, or core. And then obviously it's kind of running into the logo there, but how all of that impacts, your ability to find the ball. So I mentioned I'll stop sharing the screen here, and we'll go through kind of the specifics of how that all works. So let's see here. Right. So if you grab my stick here. Okay, so we talk about with your head to the ball. If you have your stick in your hand, obviously you want to make sure that your head is tracking towards the ball, and that's really important. And I think if you're leaning when you're trying to save the ball on shots to say up high in particular, where you're leaning that head towards the ball, those small things like that when you're leaning the ball really impact your ability to see the ball. And I'll show you why. So if I'm in my stance, okay, and I'm going to save that ball, and my head is leaning into a shot. If I see the ball here, okay, in front of me with my eyes, and then I'm leaning my head like this small gap, okay, from where my eyes are, to where my head moves to, okay, impacts your ability to see that ball because I have to adjust my line of sight as the shot's coming towards me. Now, in women's lacrosse, those shots are usually closer, which gives you less time to react. And step down shots from the men's lacrosse perspective are usually faster. So if I'm turning my head at all at any point, all right, when that shot's being taken, I have to adjust my line of sight and have a very small fraction, a small amount of time, okay, to be able to find that ball. So we want to keep that head, okay, still as possible, and it moves with our body. So if the shot's lower, obviously I'm going to go down, but my head stays to that ball. So a shot that would go up high, I'm not leaning into it. I'm sitting, okay, and keeping my head in place and using my eyes to find the ball, okay, rather than turning your head towards the ball. All right. So next couple of things here. So talk about hand placement. I know I've seen a lot of goalies do a lot of different things with how you hold the stick. The wider you hold your hands, the less movement you're able to. It limits your range of motion when you hold the stick and how you move to the ball. Okay, and obviously if your hands are really narrow, what happens is if I'm going off stick, let's say, I have to do more, okay, with my body to get over there because my hands are closer together, particularly off stick hip. If I'm going under, okay, to save that ball, it's going to cause me to have to reach more because of how close my hands are. And like I said, if my hands are really wide, I've seen some goalies play it there like that. Again, that's going to make it really challenging because my hand motion is a lot slower to the ball. So I like to say we want to keep our hands hip width apart. So I put my top hand on my hip bone, my bottom hand on my hip bone. And for me, in the way that I like to coach it, that is the optimal positioning to be able to move to the ball, okay, and make it easier to do that, which again, easier means less work to throw the ball, which means it's easier to find the ball. All right. And so from there, okay, I've seen a lot of different hand motions about where you hold your stick. I prefer, and I've seen some goalies have it to the side here, up here, hands in tight, okay, hands out front. But the way I like to coach it is I think this is kind of silly, but I like to tell our goalies to keep their hands straight out front and then chop their top hand. So they have a small bend up top so their hands are in front. And the reason you want to have those hands in front is because if I'm trying to see the ball, okay, the tighter my hands are into my body, the less I'm going to see it as that ball gets to me. So I always have our goalies with their helmets on, put their hands on the chest and look down with their helmet. Obviously, you're not going to be able to see a lot of your hand because it's in tight to your body. So any shot that happens when my hands are in tight, I'm going to lose the ball naturally as it gets to me. The other thing that does if my hands are in tight in my stance or to the side even is I see a lot of goalies right before the shot, saving it, punching that hand out. And so the way I like to think about that is a catcher in baseball. A catcher in baseball receives a pitch, let's say point A to B. So the starting point, pitch happens, receives the pitch B, A to B. If a catcher in baseball were to go A, B, C, they would not have a lot of success, even if they have an idea of the pitch location, because that extra little added bonus creates more tension to go to that ball. So I like to the hands out front and receiving versus punching thing is important for me because I think if your hands are out front, that means you're going to see this ball everywhere you go. Okay. And so that makes it easier to get attractive shots all over. And then in doing that, by not having my hands in tight, I don't have a lot of tension and I'm more likely to receive the ball as opposed to punching the ball to an area. Okay. Which I think if you look on Instagram, you see the slow motion clips, see a lot of that where goalies are going past the ball with not a lot of control because of that reason. And so I think that's really valuable to have those hands out front. And then again, instead of trying to punch to an area really quickly, you're going to the ball and finding it into that stick. And I think it goes back to the perception of how you see the ball. Like if I see a step down shot in the men's game and I think it's going to go really fast, I'm less likely to be more relaxed and go to that ball because I think I have to move really quickly. And that I do that time and time again with goalies that I do lessons with, and it pays off very frequently, just about every time. So the other part of your upper body is your core, okay? And I see this happen too with goalies where they're leaning into the shots, okay? Same thing we talked about before. If I'm leaning into a shot, okay? Let's say it's right here off the kick, and I lean my body into it, that period from where I'm set in my stance and balanced to here, now I again have to adjust my line of sight, okay? And that lean, what it also does is it gets your hands very hard if you're leaning over to keep those hands out in front of you to save that ball, particularly the lower you get. So if I tilt my screen down, you can see, like if I'm going down and I'm leaning into it here, it's going to be very challenging to not to keep those hands in front of you, okay, with that lean and stay balanced through the save. So it's really helpful to keep that core stable and try to avoid leaning into shots, okay? And the reason why that's important is because, like I said, a catcher in baseball, I like to frame a lot of these things from that perspective because the catcher in baseball is seeing 101-mile-per-hour shots pitches with movement, and they're not exploding. Now, granted, they don't have to move, but a lacrosse ball is only 6 feet wide. I'm 6'5", so it doesn't really necessarily apply to me, but even if you're 5'8", if you're standing in the middle of the goal, the distance you have to travel from where you are in the middle of the goal to the pipe is likely only max 2 feet at most, which isn't very far. And so we don't have to do as much as I think sometimes we think we do as goalies to get to those spaces. And so by maintaining the control with your head, your hands, and your core from your upper body perspective, it's going to allow you to see more of that shot and be more balanced when you do so. And I think that's really important and from those three perspective things to be able to do that. And I say this too, I didn't have that initially, but I mentioned the frame. And I'll go over that real quick so I can kind of put that in perspective here. So when we talk about the lower body, it's easy to understand. So if I'm in my stance, okay, I like to say your stance is a picture frame. So if my stance is here, like this, okay, the picture frame would be the sides and the top part of my stance here, okay? And so what I do in this, from this, and how I coach this from this perspective is that you want to try to stay in your stance when you move. So I'm trying to make this work with a limited space here. And so and the way I teach it is that my head, my hands, and my feet all move at the same time to be able to find the ball. If my hands go first, that's going to cause me to reach. And if I'm reaching, that means that my hip's going to open up away from the ball. Okay, and I do this thing with goalies all the time that I start working with first. New goalies that I work with is I have them turn the opposite direction where I'm shooting and I throw the ball in the goal. And it's stupid, but it's funny in the sense of like, if I'm looking this way, away from the shooter, and I can't see the ball. So that's kind of how I frame everything in terms of seeing and taking the balls. You always want to try to be square to the shooter so you can see it. So back to the idea of the frame. I'm trying not to go too quickly here. But again, frame is the side and above. My hands go out, my hips open up away from the shooter, okay, which means I'm not going to likely see the ball at the end, and I'll lose sight of it. If my feet go first, same thing as before. If my feet go first, then my hips are opening up away from the shooter, same thing, and then my hands are likely to follow behind, which means they're going to be in tight, and it's going to be really challenging there, again, to stay square to the shooter. And if my head is going really quickly outside and I'm leaning, those motions and movements also outside of that frame, okay, will cause you to miss the ball. So again, if we talk about moving in the frame and the shot is an off-stick hip shot, obviously a lot of goalies feel like they struggle with that. That head, hands, and feet with a short step to the ball, everything's in front of you, and we're balanced through the save. Again, that balance, that control, that patience, the receiving of that ball, all those things make it easier to be able to track the ball to your stick. So before we move on to the lower body, are there any questions or anything that I can answer from that perspective?
If you guys got questions, drop them in the Q&A box. My question is, where do you think that idea of getting your head behind the shot, where do you think that came from? Because I've certainly heard some goalie coaches and seen goalie coaches talk about that. And I'm just curious, where did that come from?
I'm not sure. I think the idea maybe trying to find that ball, it just depends on how you think about it. From my perspective, I think if you're doing it in a way that makes you have to lean to get your head behind that ball, I think two things are likely happening. Your hands are closer to your body, and you're reaching for that ball. So I think you can still get your head behind the ball, but do it in a way where everything is moving within that frame. And then I think that makes that whole thing a little bit easier. I don't know if that answers your question specifically.
Yeah, I think so. It's just, yeah, I mean, I don't know. I'd like to go out to the field and like try it out and kind of see what's going on, and how it works for each goalie, you know? All right.
Well, and I'll say this too. Like, and I don't, and I train a goalie. I don't go into it. I go into it with an idea, like a base of how I want to do things.
Yeah.
But then I think that evolves. It's all dependent upon the goalie. You know, and it could be somebody that I've worked with for years. It could be someone brand new. But I think you have to. That's why I think there's a value in kind of individual work with goalie coaches, because you have to really get into the head of what the goalie's thinking, to be able to understand where the physical issues are coming up from. And I feel like a lot of the times it has nothing to do with the physical. All the stuff we're talking about is all done when that mental part of it is in place. So it's almost like it's for not for newer goalies necessarily, but experienced goalies. It really doesn't even, like, as an example, I met someone today who drove down from Maryland, never met her before, and it was in doing the base kind of start that I always usually do with every goalie. I was kind of able to figure out what things we can work on, and I felt like by the end of the session, we had it down where all the physical things we're talking about right now didn't even come into play. It was just addressing the perception, the being present, and all those things, and that took care of the physical part of it. But obviously, from a newer goalie's perspective, these things are very helpful to kind of understand and get a base to be able to learn it the easiest way, I guess.
Yeah. There was a question about that concept you mentioned of kind of like going beyond the shot. Could you explain that a little more? Because like one of the, what they're saying is like, well, I want to explode, right? I want to explode to that shot, kind of like a sprinter running through the finish line, right? Could you kind of explain, your thoughts on that?
Well, I think from my perspective, I think a lot of it, if you're in my mind, I don't like to use the word explode, because I don't think anything in terms of exploding anything, there's no control involved with that. And so I don't think it's and that kind of the way that you framed it to me seems like you're just trying to get to an area as fast as you can because your perception is that you aren't able to get there, or the shooter shoots the ball too hard, or you know what I mean? I think there's a lot of weight putting on the type of shot that you're having to save.
Yeah.
And so I think it's about keeping those hands in front and finding that ball to where you have to go to, not going to the area as fast as you can. I don't know if that answers the question specifically, but
yeah, it's kind of like a mental thing. Yeah, right. I mean, yeah, you're not exploding to the shot. It's like this mental switch of like, well, I can easily catch this, right?
And what I'll do is I'll put a video on my Instagram tomorrow. And I did this the other day with a couple of goalies where I did 8-yard step downs uncontested. And I can shoot and I'm not saying like, I can shoot the ball really hard and really cool. What I'm saying is I'm not shooting the ball soft. Like I'm a big dude and I can shoot the ball hard. But what I want, and it was girls and guys, so it didn't matter. But I'll share a video tomorrow, and you can, if you want to take a look at it, you'll notice the way that they're saving these shots from 8 to 10 yards out, as hard as I can shoot it. It looks like I'm warming them up, and it's mostly because we've taken, based off the things that we worked on in that particular day, we took the mental part of it and applied it into the step down itself. So those 8 to 10 yard shots were easy because they could track the ball the entire way. And I'll share that tomorrow on my Instagram feed, so you can take a look at it.
Cool. Yeah, I want to check that out. I mentioned before we hit record that you can certainly tell like when a goalie has been coached by you, Coach Tim, because they're just so fluid and they do that exact motion that you did, right? Staying in that stance and being calm and relaxed. And I think those are great attributes to have as lacrosse goalies. That's for sure.
Yeah, for sure. I think sometimes that the goalies that I work with maybe get knocked for it a little bit because it looks too easy. It's like almost like they're not fast enough, which is interesting. And I think maybe it's something for another.
From college coaches, they get knocked. You mean?
I've heard that, a couple times. Not necessarily. I think once the initial when they initially get seen, and then once the consistency there, they're saving those things a lot more frequently. Then I think obviously that goes away. But the initial thought is always like it almost looks like it's too easy.
You're making this too easy out here. You're making it too easy. Ellie Thomas has a good question.
Sure.
How do I keep my hands steady and up? So she says she's not afraid of the ball, but when a shooter comes in, she often hitches with the hand dip. What is your thoughts on that one?
Well, and that's funny. That something like that came up recently today. Actually, it was today, especially on those inside shots. I think again, if you go back to perception, and I hate to like kind of be like the hippie country, you just keep talking about mental stuff, but I think it's about perception. So for my question would be, most or to her would be, on inside shots, do you feel like you have a chance? One, and two, how much time do you think you have between when the shooter releases the ball to when you're saving it? And I think from that perspective, I think on inside shots, if your hands are dipping in, my thought is you're not being patient inside, and so not waiting for that ball to come out, and you're moving prior to that shot again to get to an area really quickly because of the fact that it's an inside shot and it may be more challenging. So from the way that I would try to coach that is, and what you can do on your own is, if a shooter is taking inside shots on you, you could just wait and then say the word shot when you see the ball leave the stick. And so that's your verbal cue, will allow you to try to lock in on that ball once it's released from the stick, and see if you notice a difference on your movement to the ball. And what I've noticed is, in doing this again for the last like month or so, that I've tried to apply this kind of idea, is that by locking in with that verbal cue, you're not going to a space really quickly, and you're identifying the ball leaving the stick and making the save as a result of it. And I think, and again, it goes back to that idea of being more patient. So that would be my tip for that. If the hands are coming in and getting really tense, it's likely because you're rushing to a spot to beat a shooter to a spot, or not trying to find the ball, but go to the area because you don't think you have a lot of time.
Yeah. I know you're a big fan of patting the feet as well. I think we're going to touch on that maybe a little bit later. But do you find that I also find that like when you do that, like it kind of gets you into this mental mindset of like bring it, right? Like, and now you're not all of a sudden you're not fearing that ball, you're not doing these extra movements, you're just ready to and set.
For sure.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Yeah. And I think what it does, from the physical standpoint, it obviously balances your feet up too, to allow you to move right to left easier, so you're not favoring. And we'll talk about that in a second when we talk about the lower body part of it.
Yeah. Well, cool. I think we're good on questions. There's some more questions, but they're on sort of different topics, and we can hit those at the end. Let's keep going.
Perfect. So I'll share my screen again so we can take a look at the next section of the presentation here. So in talking about the lower body, we're going to talk about the hips, which in my opinion, that's why I have all these asterisks there or stars there, is because I think it's the most important part about your ability to find the ball. And so we'll talk about what that looks like and how it impacts it. We'll talk about what happens with the weight pushing forward in your knees, which is kind of related to where your hips are. And then we'll talk about feet, whether what that means to be in the balls of your feet, because I found, which I didn't even know, that a lot of people don't know where the balls of your feet are. So we'll look at that. You can, and then we'll talk about patting the feet and how that applies and what to do and how that allows you to find the ball. And I'll preface this by saying too, like, obviously we're talking about a lot of things here, but like I mentioned before, if we take care of the mental side of it, all of these things take care of themselves because we're present, we're not thinking about them, and you're able to easily find the ball. And I think that's kind of, again, the theme that keeps going back to us. If you think about these things in the moment, it's going to impact your ability to find the ball. So you want to make sure that if you're working on these things, how you save the ball, all this stuff, it's being done, like I said, preparing mentally beforehand, or even if it's like a drill, you're doing it before the drill starts or before the shot is taken, and not while the shot is happening. So you want to make sure that that analysis is not happening in the moment, but it's happening either before, like a lot of time before, or when you're done with that particular drill. Because again, thinking about that a lot is not being in the present, which makes it more challenging. So I'll stop the screen share here so we can go through it again from the perspective of the lower body here. So like I mentioned, when we talk about the hips, I like to, and I preach this often, about having your hips sitting back. And so what that means in your stance is, I see a lot of this, other people commenting about it, and how they coach it and things like that. But from my perspective, it's important that you're sitting down, okay, not too deep, okay, because the lower I get in my stance, the more tension it creates. So for me, it's about creating less tension to be relaxed. And so if I am really deep in my stance, like people who lift weights, obviously you build muscle by creating tension, and that tension is going to make it make it harder to be more patient and relaxed. So the hips sitting back is really important because it allows you to have a solid base to be able to move and be balanced. So hips coming forward, like I talked about on the clip there, riding escalator. That means, and you see it in Instagram clips all the time, never slow down. Obviously, I think the content creators and what they do, having those slow down clips is extremely valuable because it shows you what goalies are doing prior to shot and how much it impacts their ability to make the save. So what that means is when you're riding the escalator down is prior to that shot, the weight shifts from sitting down or their stances in their knees, and they're slowly going down into that falling motion. So that reaction to that ball is really kind of chaotic. And you can see it because if I'm falling down like this, let's just compare it to anything else, catching a football. If I'm falling when someone throws a football at me or a baseball, it's going to be really hard to be able to catch that baseball or football. Same thing on lacrosse. And you see it all the time with the high shots, on bounce shots even, where goalies are pushing forward. And then from this motion, hands usually get in tight, and then we're not able to locate that ball, which makes it really challenging, again, to be able to consistently find the ball. So I like to say that you want to sit through the save. So, and then we go back to that having the ball. If I'm in my stance and I'm saving a shot and I see it here, let me put the camera here, and I'm saving the ball and I'm up here. I'm in my stance and I see the ball here, and I stand up because my hips come forward. Again, you talk about a gap difference in how I have to adjust my eyes in a small fraction of a second when a shot's being taken, and that adjustment makes it really challenging to find the ball. And how that shows up is when you see goalies hands go like this as the shot's coming, instead of just moving to that ball, their hands are moving around before that shot comes because they're in their stance sitting. Shot comes, that tension builds up, hips are pushing forward, and you get that kind of like awkward, I don't know what to do with my hand motion towards the ball. And so by sitting, the other point I made on the prior point was sitting through the save. So whether the ball's low or up high, the ball's down low, we're sitting in that stance comfortably, okay, relaxed, hips are pushed back, my chest is slightly tucked forward to counterbalance that weight. My hands are out front, like we talked about, but when that shot goes, I keep my hands out front and my hips pushed back, so that way I'm able to, like I'm showing here, be balanced through the save and not falling and rushing. The same thing goes for shots up top, okay? A lot of goalies, most goalies, unless you're maybe U10 or U12 or you're a shorter goalie, most goalies sticks when they're in their stance are just at the pipe, okay? So there's no reason for you to, when a shot's up high, okay, to reach up above the goal, okay? And I see it a lot of times when the hips come forward, and you can, again, go on Instagram and look at any content creator that makes clips. You see goalies here in the stance, shots up, they rise up with the ball or jump up, and their sticks above where the ball's going in. So two things here. By meeting that ball in front with your hands out in front, okay, and having those hips back in the save, you save the ball in front with your hips back, sitting through the save, allows you to see that ball for the entire time, not bouncing up and down. Okay, I'm moving through that ball with my hips sitting through the save, up or down, okay, which allows me to see the entire ball. And I go back to that catcher and baseball thing. Catcher and baseball sitting to receive the pitch. Before the pitch, he goes like this. Again, I don't think he's going to have a lot of luck catching or receiving that pitch prior to the shot if he's moving. Now, again, catchers don't move like lacrosse goalies, but I think the idea is when you're moving through the save, you're trying to do it with as little movement of your body as possible so that you can be balanced, relaxed, and controlled and be able to see the entire ball. So the next thing to talk about is the knees. And I see this a lot in the stance where the hips are forward and the knees are pushed here in the stance. Okay. And I think if my knees are forward here, I always ask the goalies I work with, how many things in any sport do you do that's athletic with your knees forward like this? I can't think of very many at all. And so and if I think the other thing you can do is if you're a coach or if you're getting shot on is have the guys or girls hitch or fake shot before the shot releases. And what you'll find is, again, that false step forward with the weight pushing forward their knees, which again will make it very challenging to find that ball. So we want to, again, sit back into it and sit through the save and avoid starting with that weight forward in the knees. Okay. And the other thing you can do is just walk like this. I don't think I see anybody walk like this. All right, with their knees forward, and it looks stupid. But the point is, if I'm walking like that, it's going to look really silly and ridiculous. So if I'm trying to save the ball like that, it's going to make it really challenging. And the other thing is, if you have knee problems, it's going to really make that a lot harder, okay, as you get older. Because when you get older, obviously you're not as mobile as you were when you were younger. So it's really important, I think, again, to be able to sit in those shots. Okay, and so the last part of this is where is your feet. So you get to look at my growth stocks. What I want to show is the balls of your feet, okay, is the pad that's underneath your toes here. Okay, I've had people tell me the balls of the feet are back here on the hips. That being on your toes is in the ball, is where the balls of your feet are. But the balls of your feet are that pad that's right under your toes. And the way that you can figure out where the balls of your feet are, and I'm not going to show you my feet on the ground, but I'll pull the camera up here, is you put your whole foot on the ground and you lift just your toes up. And if you're at home, you can do this right now where you're sitting in a chair. You can put your whole foot on the ground with your heels down and just lift your toes up. That section under your toes, that's where the balls of your feet are. And so being in the balls of your feet doesn't mean I'm leaning forward and my toes and then my heels have to come off the ground. Okay, because all that does is create that falling motion and more tension. Okay, so when your hips come forward and all that weight drives forward in your knees, that's usually when the heels come up off the ground and you get that falling motion that's not controlled, which obviously is going to make it really hard to be able to find the ball. Okay, so if you're sitting in the balls of your feet, again, with your hips back, chest slightly forward, weight in the balls of your feet with your heels down, okay, that will give you the balance that you need to stay patient. So if someone fakes, hitches, if the ball is redirected or anything like that, you're able to respond to it more athletically because you're more balanced through those saves and those shots. And the way that you can test this is to have, if you have a goalie coach, another goalie that you work with, whoever it is you get in your stance like this and you sit and you start, you start with your feet together and you blow a whistle. With your feet together, you go to your stance and you kind of bounce, but intentionally to create tension. And what you would do from there is you either push the other goalie, not hard, push them in the front of their shoulder or the back of their shoulder. If you push them in the front and they fall back on their heels, that means that the weight is sitting back more in their heels, not in the balls of the feet, and likely that their chest is upright. Okay, so you can counteract that by sticking those hips out again, chest forward. That'll eliminate your falling backward, okay, doing that too. The next part is if you do the same thing, blow the whistle, feet together, set your feet and push from the back of the shoulder, and you're falling forward. That tells you likely that the weight is in your knees and not sitting in your hips, again, which will make it hard to be balanced and controlled through the save and see the ball through it. So just by doing that simple thing, you can really start to figure out how you get balance in your stance. And the way I like to think about it is this. If you're building, let's say you take a bunch of Jenga blocks or blocks. Nobody builds blocks with one block at the bottom and 5 blocks at the top. You have to have a good base underneath of you and having your feet shoulder width apart, just outside of shoulder width apart, with those hips back to give you a sturdy base to be able to support moving in an athletic way and being balanced through those saves. And now the last part of it is patting your feet. So what that means is, and I got asked this on Instagram before about, is it like patting the feet the same as jumping? So what patting the feet is, and let me pull this forward so you can see. Patting the feet is taking your feet when you're off balance, okay? And this could happen on a hitch. Let's say a shooter hitches with the stick and then comes over the top. And so they hitch, you get tense because that shot doesn't come, and then you've got that weight driving forward. And so you counteract that by tapping the feet down, not hard, just kind of gently tapping down and sticking those hips back. And so what that does is it creates balance in both feet, which allows me to move right or left easily and not get stuck. Because if you watch where goalies are over anticipating shots or guessing and things like that, you'll see the weight is not distributed evenly in their feet. So if all the weight's in their right foot and they have to step to the right, they have to go back to the left foot to then push right, which is not enough time to be able to find the ball through the shot. So what that looks like again would be like sitting, patting the feet down to create that balance to be able to move right or left. So pushing those hips back, sitting, okay, to be able to go either direction. And what I was explaining before was if all the weight is in my left foot when they fake and I hitch and I'm leaning forward, I take a false step, okay, and I don't pad my feet. If that shot goes to my left, I have to go back to my right foot to be able to push off, or I'll just reach for it, lunge, which we talked about earlier, means my hips are going away from the ball, okay, or I go back to my right foot and push, which again means I'm not balanced, and my hips are going to move away from the ball there as well. So again, the idea is with all of this stuff is by being controlled, balanced, and moving in a way that is athletic, okay, you stay square to the shooter more frequently, and you're able to find the ball more frequently, which means you're going to make more saves. Because I think any goalie can say when they're in a groove and they're doing really well,